Chapter 1, The Flag in the Window. Thomas Brennan had loved his country for 47 years without questioning what that meant. It was a love inherited from his father, who'd served in Korea, and before him, a grandfather who'd landed at Normandy with hands that never quite stopped shaking. Love of country, in the Brennan household, wasn't a political stance, it was air, it was gravity, it was the unspoken foundation beneath every meal and holiday and Sunday morning. The flag in his front window had hung there for 16 years, since the week after the towers fell. His daughter Emma was 9 then, and she'd helped him position it just right, her small fingers pressing the suction cup against the glass while he smoothed out the creases in the nylon. The neighborhood had been full of flags that autumn, every porch, every car antenna, a forest of red, white, and blue sprouting from collective grief and defiant unity. Most of those flags were gone now, faded into memory or storage boxes. Thomas's remained. This particular October morning arrived cold and gray over Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the kind of morning where frost traced delicate patterns on windshields and breath hung visible in the air. Thomas stood at his kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its gurgling ritual, watching through the window as his neighbor Ed Kowalski scraped ice from his truck. Ed's flag decal had started peeling from his rear bumper. Thomas had noticed it last week but said nothing. People got busy. Life moved on. The symbols that once meant everything became just another thing to maintain, to remember, to care about amid the thousand other demands of ordinary existence. The coffee finished brewing. Thomas poured it into the same mug he'd used for a decade, emblazoned with the county sheriff's department logo, a gift from his cousin Rick, who'd retired from the force 3 years ago. The ceramic was chipped at the rim now, but Thomas liked the weight of it in his hands, the reliable heat seeping into his palms. At the small kitchen table, he opened his laptop and began his morning routine: email, local news, the community forum where neighbors posted about lost cats and roadwork and occasionally argued about property taxes. He'd been doing technical writing for a defense contractor for 22 years. The work was steady, if not exciting, translating engineers' specifications into documentation that military personnel could actually understand and use. He'd never handled classified material, never seen the weapons systems his manuals described in action. His contribution to national security was measured in clearly written procedures and accurately labeled diagrams. It was honest work. Important work, he'd always believed. He was part of something larger than himself. The local news site loaded slowly, ads cluttering the margins. The lead story was about the county fair committee debating whether to raise booth fees next year. Below that, a piece about the high school football team's playoff chances. Thomas scrolled, sipping his coffee, barely registering the words. This was the rhythm of his mornings, the gentle wash of local concerns, the reassurance that his small corner of the world remained predictable, manageable, safe. Then a headline caught his eye, buried near the bottom of the page: local teacher placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The teacher's name was Jennifer Hayworth. Thomas knew her, not well, but enough to nod hello at the grocery store. She'd taught history at Millbrook High for at least a decade, maybe longer. His daughter had taken her American history class years ago and spoke well of her. She actually makes it interesting, Emma had said, which from a teenager was high praise indeed. The article was brief, almost deliberately vague. Jennifer Hayworth had been placed on administrative leave following concerns about classroom materials. The school board declined to comment on the specifics, citing personnel privacy. Parents were assured that student safety remained the district's top priority. The investigation was ongoing. Thomas read it twice, trying to extract meaning from what wasn't said. Classroom materials, what did that mean? Inappropriate content? Political bias? He tried to remember what Emma had told him about Hayworth's class, but the details were lost to time. Emma had graduated 4 years ago. She was working in Philadelphia now, living her own life, building her own relationship with the world. He clicked through to the comments section, something he usually avoided. The comments on local news stories were typically either inflammatory or inane, rarely worth the spike in blood pressure. But he was curious what people were saying, what his neighbors thought. The comment thread had already grown long. Most of the early comments were supportive of the school board's decision, praising their vigilance and commitment to protecting children. Several people mentioned indoctrination without specifying what that meant. A few comments questioned the vagueness of the charges, asking for more transparency. Those comments had been replied to with suspicion, "Why are you defending her?" and "Found the liberal," and "If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't fear accountability." Thomas felt something stir in his chest, not quite alarm, not quite unease, but a cousin to both. The tone felt wrong somehow. Jennifer Hayworth wasn't some activist or radical. She was a middle-aged woman who coached junior varsity softball and volunteered at the food bank. Whatever she'd done, if she'd done anything, surely warranted more than this vague condemnation by innuendo. He closed the laptop and finished his coffee in silence. Outside, Ed had finished scraping his windshield and was climbing into his truck, breath pluming white. The engine coughed to life. The morning proceeded according to its ancient patterns. But something had shifted, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm. Thomas couldn't name it yet, couldn't articulate why a 3-paragraph article about a teacher he barely knew had lodged itself in his thoughts like a splinter. He only knew that the coffee tasted different now, that the kitchen seemed dimmer, that the flag in his window, his beloved, faithful flag, suddenly felt like a question he didn't know how to answer. Chapter 2, The Meeting. 3 days passed before Thomas thought about Jennifer Hayworth again. Work consumed the intervening time, a rush project, new specifications for a radar system component that needed documentation by Friday. He'd stayed late Tuesday and Wednesday, microwaving leftovers at his desk, his eyes burning from the screen's glare. By Thursday evening, when he finally left the office at 6:30, the teacher's suspension had receded to the back of his mind, filed away with other minor local dramas that didn't require his attention. But Thursday night, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Rick's name, his cousin, the retired sheriff's deputy. They talked maybe once a month, usually about football or fishing, comfortable conversations between men who'd known each other their entire lives. "Tom, you busy?" Rick's voice carried an edge Thomas didn't recognize. "Just eating dinner." "What's up?" A pause. Thomas could hear voices in the background, the clink of glasses. Rick was at a bar somewhere, or a restaurant. "You heard about this teacher thing at the high school?" Thomas set down his fork. "Hayworth?" "Yeah, I saw something online. Administrative leave, right?" "Right." Another pause. "I'm at Hannigan's with some guys from the department. Current guys, not old-timers like me. We're talking about it," and Rick's voice dropped lower. "Tom, something's not sitting right with me about this whole thing." "What do you mean?" "Mike Garrett's here, you know Mike, works patrol, he's saying his kid is in Hayworth's class." "Was in her class?" "According to his kid, she didn't do anything wrong. She was teaching about the Pentagon Papers, that whole Vietnam thing from the 70s, and some parent complained that she was teaching kids to distrust the government." Thomas picked up his water glass, then set it down without drinking. "The Pentagon Papers are history. That's literally American history." "That's what I said." Rick's voice carried frustration now. "But here's the thing, Mike says the school board's getting pressure from somewhere. Not just one parent. Organized pressure. There's apparently some new group in town, calls themselves Citizens for Educational Accountability or some bullshit like that. They've been showing up at school board meetings, demanding curriculum reviews, talking about patriotic education." "That doesn't sound," Thomas stopped himself, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Didn't sound what?" "Unreasonable. American?" He felt the ground shifting beneath him, familiar words becoming slippery and strange. "Mike says they've got a list," Rick continued. "Teachers they're watching. Books they want removed from the library. It's not just Hayworth. She's just the first one they're moving on." Thomas stood up, began pacing his small kitchen. Outside, streetlights flickered on, casting orange pools on the pavement. Who are these people? Where'd they come from? That's what I'm trying to figure out. They've got a website, social media, the whole deal. Professional looking. Money behind it. But nobody knows who's actually funding it. They keep talking about traditional values and parental rights and protecting children from divisive ideology. Rick said the phrases like they tasted bad. Problem is, half of what they're saying sounds reasonable on the surface. Who's against parental rights? But then you dig into what they actually want, and he trailed off. It's what? It's about control, Tom. It's about deciding what people are allowed to learn, what questions they're allowed to ask. Mike's kid said Hayworth's whole thing was teaching them to think critically, to look at primary sources, to understand that sometimes the government lies. Because it did lie. That's documented history. But apparently that makes her dangerous now. Thomas felt his heart rate rising. The flag in his front window was visible from where he stood, illuminated by the porch light. So what happens to her? Investigation probably drags on for months. Even if they clear her, her reputation's damaged. Parents already don't trust her. Some are demanding their kids be moved to different classes. She'll probably resign eventually, just to end the nightmare. Rick's voice was heavy. And whoever's next on their list will see what happened to her and think twice before teaching anything controversial. Thomas searched for the word. That's chilling. Yeah. A longer pause. Listen, there's a school board meeting Monday night. 7 o'clock. Some of us are thinking about going, asking questions. Publicly. I wanted to give you a heads up in case you wanted to come. Thomas's instinct was to decline. He didn't do confrontation. He wasn't political. He wrote technical manuals and paid his taxes and hung his flag in the window. He voted, sure, but quietly, privately, the way it was supposed to be. Getting involved in school board politics felt like crossing a line into territory he didn't understand. But something in Rick's voice stopped him from saying no immediately. His cousin wasn't an alarmist. Rick had spent 30 years in law enforcement, had seen real threats, real dangers. If he was worried about this, maybe there was something to worry about. Let me think about it, Thomas said finally. Fair enough. Rick hesitated. Tom, you remember when Dad used to talk about why he became a cop? He'd say it was because in America, the law's supposed to protect everybody equally. Not just the people in power. Not just the people who agree with you. Everybody. Thomas remembered. Uncle Frank had said that at every family gathering, usually after a few beers, his voice getting louder and more passionate. It had embarrassed Rick as a teenager, but as an adult, Rick quoted it like scripture. I remember, Thomas said quietly. I keep thinking about that. About what it means to protect and serve. Not just enforce, protect. And I'm watching this Hayworth thing, and I'm thinking, who's protecting her? Who's protecting the truth? Because if we can't even teach documented history without it being called unpatriotic, then what the hell are we protecting? After they hung up, Thomas stood in his kitchen for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just feeling the weight of something he couldn't yet name. The house was silent except for the refrigerator's hum. The flag hung motionless in the window. Outside, Ed Kowalski's porch light went on, then off again. Someone drove past, their headlights sweeping across Thomas's walls. The ordinary world continued its ordinary rhythms. But Thomas felt himself standing at a threshold he hadn't known existed, looking at a darkness he'd never noticed before. And for the first time in his 47 years, loving his country felt complicated. Chapter 3, The Room Where Truth Dies. Monday night arrived with freezing rain, the kind that made driving treacherous and gave people excuses to stay home. Thomas almost used it as his own excuse. He'd changed clothes 3 times after work, unable to decide if attending a school board meeting required a suit or if jeans were acceptable. He finally settled on khakis and a button-down shirt, respectful but not trying too hard. Rick was waiting in the parking lot when Thomas arrived, standing under an umbrella near the high school's main entrance. A handful of other people hurried through the rain toward the doors, collars turned up against the cold. "Glad you came," Rick said, clasping Thomas's shoulder. "Wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Thomas admitted. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness outside. They followed signs to the library, where school board meetings were held. Thomas had been in this building exactly once before, for Emma's graduation. The hallways still smelled the same, floor wax and old paper and something indefinably institutional. The library was already half full. Thomas recognized some faces from around town, the woman who ran the hardware store, a guy who worked at the post office, a few younger parents he'd seen at community events. At the front of the room, 5 board members sat behind a long table, shuffling papers and speaking in low voices. They looked tired and uncomfortable, like people who'd volunteered for a simple civic duty and found themselves in the middle of something they hadn't anticipated. But it was the other side of the room that made Thomas stop walking. 20 or 30 people sat together in a distinct block, many wearing identical red t-shirts. The shirts had an American flag on the front and words Thomas couldn't quite read from this distance. They sat with straight backs and folded hands, projecting organization and purpose. Several had clipboards. One man in the front row was filming the proceedings on a professional-looking camera. "That's them," Rick murmured. "Citizens for Educational Accountability." Thomas and Rick found seats near the middle, neither with the red shirts nor conspicuously opposed to them. The room continued to fill. By 7 o'clock, nearly every seat was taken, and people lined the walls. The energy felt strange, not quite hostile, but charged with something Thomas couldn't name. Anticipation, maybe. Or dread. The board president, a thin woman named Barbara Chen whom Thomas vaguely remembered from Emma's graduation, called the meeting to order. Her voice was steady but her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. The agenda was projected on a screen: budget discussions, facility maintenance reports, personnel matters. The first 20 minutes were numbingly bureaucratic: approvals of previous minutes, reports on roof repairs and cafeteria equipment. Several board members asked questions that seemed designed to fill time, to delay the inevitable. Thomas felt himself getting drowsy, the warm room and monotonous voices lulling him despite his nervousness. Then they reached personnel matters, closed session discussion of employee investigation. Barbara Chen's voice tightened. The board has reviewed the ongoing investigation regarding a teacher currently on administrative leave. Due to personnel privacy requirements, specific details cannot be discussed in open session. However, we want to assure the community that this matter is being taken with utmost seriousness. Student safety and educational integrity remain our top priorities. A hand shot up among the red shirts. Barbara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Mr. Wilcox." A man in his 50s stood, holding a clipboard. He had silver hair and an expensive-looking suit. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Thank you, Madam President. I'm Robert Wilcox, Regional Coordinator for Citizens for Educational Accountability. We appreciate the board's diligence in this matter. However, many parents remain concerned about the lack of transparency. What assurances can you provide that this investigation will result in meaningful accountability rather than a quiet return to business as usual?" Barbara's jaw tightened. "Mr. Wilcox, as I stated, personnel matters require confidentiality. We cannot discuss." With respect, Wilcox interrupted smoothly, "We're not asking for confidential information. We're asking for assurance that teachers who undermine patriotic values and parental authority will face consequences. Our children deserve educators who strengthen their love of country, not those who teach them to question and doubt everything America stands for." Murmurs of approval rippled through the red shirts. Thomas felt his stomach clench. Another hand rose from the opposite side of the room, Mike Garrett, the police officer Rick had mentioned. Mike stood slowly, his uniform still on from his shift. "I'd like to speak to that, if I may." Barbara nodded, looking relieved. "Officer Garrett. My daughter was in Ms. Hayworth's class. Is in her class, or was before this suspension. I've reviewed the materials in question. Ms. Hayworth was teaching the Pentagon Papers, a Supreme Court case that's been part of the curriculum for years. Teaching students about that case isn't unpatriotic. The Supreme Court ruled that the public has a right to know when the government misleads them about a war. That's not anti-American. That's the First Amendment working exactly as designed." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wilcox turned to look at Mike, his expression pleasant but his eyes cold. "Officer Garrett, I'm sure you mean well. But surely you can see the difference between teaching historical facts and teaching children that their government is inherently untrustworthy. There's a pattern of behavior here." "What pattern?" Mike's voice rose. "Teaching kids to think critically. Teaching them to examine primary sources. That's what education is supposed to be. Education is supposed to transmit our values to the next generation," Wilcox replied, his voice hardening. "Not to turn them against those values. Not to make them ashamed of their country." Thomas found himself on his feet before he'd decided to stand. His voice emerged rougher than he'd intended, shaking slightly. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I'm a veteran's son and a defense contractor employee. I've had a flag in my window for 16 years. And I'm confused about when asking questions became unpatriotic." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward him. Thomas felt his face flush but forced himself to continue. "My whole life, I was taught that America was great because we could question authority. Because we had free speech and free press and the right to challenge power. Now I'm hearing that teaching kids about times when the government lied, which is documented historical fact, is somehow anti-American. That doesn't make sense to me." Wilcox smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Brennan, are you suggesting that you support teaching children to distrust their own country?" "I'm suggesting," Thomas said, his voice steadier now, "that patriotism and blind obedience aren't the same thing." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas saw several of the red shirts writing on their clipboards. The man with the camera turned it slightly toward him. And in that moment, Thomas understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he had just crossed an invisible line, that by asking a simple question, he had marked himself as something other than what he'd been when he walked into this room. He was no longer just a patriot. He was a problem. Chapter 4, When the Knock Comes. The first sign came Wednesday morning, 2 days after the meeting. Thomas was eating breakfast when his phone buzzed with a notification from Facebook, a platform he barely used except to see photos of Emma and her friends. Someone had tagged him in a post. He opened the app with mild curiosity that curdled instantly into something darker. The post was from the Citizens for Educational Accountability page, and it featured a photo of him standing at the school board meeting. The image was grainy but clear enough. The caption read, "Thomas Brennan, defense contractor, publicly defending anti-American curriculum at Monday's school board meeting. How many others like him have security clearances? Who's watching the watchers?" His coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering against the tile floor. Brown liquid spread across the white surface, but Thomas couldn't move. He stared at the screen, reading the comments piling up beneath the post. This is exactly the kind of infiltration we've been warning about. Someone needs to report him to his employer. Defense contractors should be held to higher standards of patriotism. Thank you for exposing these people. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Thomas's hands were shaking. He set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. The flag in his window caught his eye, still hanging there, faithful and unchanged. But now it felt like evidence at a crime scene, insufficient proof of an innocence he'd always assumed was obvious. He called Rick. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. At 9:30, his work phone rang. His supervisor, Dale Henderson, a man he'd worked with for 15 years and considered a friend. "Tom, can you come to my office? HR needs to talk with you." The walk down the corridor felt infinite. Dale's door was open. Inside, Dale sat behind his desk looking miserable, and beside him sat Patricia Voss from Human Resources, her expression professionally neutral in a way that made Thomas's chest tighten. "Tom, sit down," Dale said quietly. Patricia opened a folder. "Mr. Brennan, we've received several complaints regarding social media posts that suggest you may have concerns about your reliability for handling sensitive projects." "Sensitive projects?" Thomas's voice came out strangled. "I write instruction manuals. I don't have access to classified information. I never have." "Nevertheless," Patricia continued, "given the nature of our contracts with the Department of Defense, all employees are expected to maintain standards of," she consulted her notes, "of loyal discretion and patriotic judgment." "I attended a school board meeting," Thomas said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "I asked a question about education. That's protected speech. That's the First Amendment." Dale looked away, his jaw working. Patricia's expression didn't change. "No one is questioning your legal rights, Mr. Brennan. However, this company must be sensitive to concerns from our government partners. We've been advised that your security paperwork may be subject to review. Until that review is complete, we're placing you on administrative leave." The phrase hit Thomas like a fist. Administrative leave. The same words that had started this whole nightmare for Jennifer Hayworth. "Who advised you?" Thomas demanded. "Who complained?" Patricia closed her folder. "That information is confidential. You'll continue to receive pay during the review period. We'll be in touch." Thomas drove home in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. The sky was overcast, threatening snow. The streets of Millbrook looked the same as always, familiar houses, familiar cars, the coffee shop where he sometimes got lunch, the park where he pushed Emma on swings 20 years ago. Everything unchanged. Everything different. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. Rick, finally returning his calls. "Tom, Jesus, I've been trying to reach you. They came to my house." "Who came to your house?" "Two guys. Said they were from some private security firm doing background checks. Asking about you. Asking if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior, any concerning statements, any associations with anti-government groups." Rick's voice was tight with anger. "I told them to get the hell off my property." Thomas felt the world tilting. "Rick, I lost my job. They suspended me pending some kind of review." Silence on the line. Then, "Tom, this is organized. This isn't random. They're coming after anyone who spoke up at that meeting. Mike Garrett got pulled aside by his captain this morning, asked about his political activities. Sarah Chen, Barbara Chen's daughter, she's a teacher in the next district, she got a visit from someone claiming to be evaluating teacher performance. This is coordinated. But why?" Thomas heard the plaintive note in his voice and hated it. "We just asked questions. We didn't threaten anyone. We didn't break any laws." "That's exactly why," Rick said softly. "Because questions are dangerous. Questions lead to doubt. Doubt leads to resistance. They're not trying to stop you from breaking laws, Tom. They're trying to stop you from thinking." That evening, Thomas sat in his kitchen as darkness fell, unable to turn on the lights. The flag in his window glowed faintly from the streetlight outside. He thought about his father, about his grandfather, about all the stories of sacrifice and service he'd been raised on. He thought about what those men had actually fought for, not just the symbol of the flag, but the principles it was supposed to represent. Freedom of speech. Freedom of thought. Freedom to question authority without being destroyed for it. His phone buzzed. Another notification. Someone had posted his home address online, along with the message, "Patriots need to know who their enemies are." Thomas looked at the flag in his window, the flag he'd loved for 47 years, the flag he believed protected him simply by virtue of his loyalty to it. And he understood, finally and completely, the terrible truth that had been lurking beneath everything. The flag didn't protect you. It never had. It only protected the people who decided what patriotism meant. And he was no longer one of them. Chapter 5, What Remains. The investigation took 4 months. 4 months of Thomas sitting in his house, watching his savings dwindle, while anonymous voices on the internet debated whether he was a traitor or merely misguided. 4 months of walking past his flag every morning and wondering if he should take it down, but never quite able to do it. 4 months of learning what it meant to be redefined by strangers who'd never met him, never spoken to him, never tried to understand what he actually believed. Jennifer Hayworth resigned in December. No announcement, no statement, just a quiet administrative note that she'd accepted a position elsewhere. Thomas knew what that meant. There was no position elsewhere. There was only the exhaustion of fighting a battle where the rules kept changing, where defending yourself was treated as further evidence of guilt. Mike Garrett transferred to a different department, desk duty, away from the public, where his judgment issues wouldn't be a liability. Sarah Chen left teaching entirely. One by one, the people who'd spoken up at that school board meeting found their lives rearranged, not through official punishment but through 1,000 small pressures that made continuing unbearable. Rick was the only one who seemed unchanged, perhaps because he was already retired, already beyond the reach of employment threats. He came over most evenings, bringing takeout or groceries, refusing to let Thomas disappear into isolation. They didn't talk much about what was happening. There wasn't much to say. They'd watch football or play cards or just sit in comfortable silence, two men who'd known each other their whole lives, anchoring each other against a current that threatened to sweep them away. In January, Thomas's company finally completed their review. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, clinical and bloodless in its language. After careful consideration, they determined that Thomas's continued employment represented an unacceptable reputational risk to government contract relationships. His termination was effective immediately. Severance would be provided in accordance with company policy. They wished him well in his future endeavors. Thomas read the letter 3 times, waiting to feel something: anger, grief, betrayal. But there was only a hollow numbness, the emotional equivalent of white noise. He'd been erased with a paragraph and a signature. 22 years reduced to unacceptable reputational risk. He thought about fighting it. Rick knew a lawyer, someone who handled employment discrimination. But when Thomas researched the firm online, he found they'd recently been featured on a news website as ambulance chasers profiting from frivolous anti-patriotism claims. The lawyer had received death threats. His children had been harassed at school. Thomas didn't make the call. February brought snow and cold that settled into his bones. The house was too quiet. Emma called twice a week, her voice careful, trying to be supportive without quite understanding what her father was going through. She was young, her career just beginning. Thomas didn't tell her about the social media posts that sometimes included her name, linking her to his anti-American statements. He didn't want that weight on her shoulders. One evening, as freezing rain tapped against the windows, Rick showed up with a bottle of whiskey and an unusual expression, something between determination and sadness. "I've been thinking," Rick said, pouring 2 glasses, "about what gets remembered. About what actually matters in the long run." Thomas accepted the glass but didn't drink. "What brought this on?" "I found some of my dad's old stuff in the attic. Letters he wrote during Vietnam, before he became a cop. He was 20 years old, scared out of his mind, watching friends die. And you know what he wrote to my mom? He said the scariest thing wasn't the combat. It was realizing that the people giving the orders didn't know what they were doing, and admitting that out loud got you accused of being a coward." Rick took a long drink. He came home from that war angry. Spent the rest of his life trying to make sure the system worked better, that authority deserved respect instead of just demanding it. That's why he became a cop, not to enforce power, but to make power accountable. He looked at Thomas. You know what he'd say about what happened to you? Thomas shook his head. He'd say you were the patriot. He'd say the people who destroyed your life for asking one honest question, they're the ones who betrayed everything that flag is supposed to mean. Thomas finally raised his glass, the whiskey burning warm down his throat. Doesn't change what happened. No, Rick agreed. But it changes what it means. They sat in silence for a while, the rain continuing its relentless percussion. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I've been thinking about taking down the flag. Rick didn't respond immediately. Then, why? Because it feels like a lie now. Like I'm claiming membership in something that doesn't want me anymore. Or, Rick said slowly, you keep it up because that flag belongs to you as much as it belongs to them. More, maybe. Because you actually understand what it's supposed to represent. Thomas looked at the flag, visible in the lamplight, its colors somehow both faded and vivid. I don't know if I believe that anymore. Then believe this, Rick said. Someday, maybe not soon, but someday, people will ask how this happened. How asking questions became treason. How loyalty became synonymous with obedience. And when they ask, there needs to be someone who remembers that some of us fought back. Even if we lost. Spring came slowly to Millbrook, the snow melting in patches, revealing the brown grass underneath. Thomas found work doing freelance technical writing, nothing steady, nothing that felt like a career. But it was enough to pay the bills, enough to survive. The Citizens for Educational Accountability moved on to other targets, other school boards, other towns. Their website grew more sophisticated. Their funding sources remained opaque. The country continued its slow, grinding transformation into something Thomas no longer quite recognized. But the flag stayed in his window. Not because Thomas had resolved his doubts about what it meant. Not because he'd made peace with what had happened to him. It stayed because Rick was right, it belonged to him as much as to anyone. It belonged to his father who'd served, to his grandfather who'd landed on bloody beaches, to every person who believed that America was supposed to be better than the sum of its fears. Some mornings, Thomas looked at that flag and felt only bitterness. Other mornings, he looked at it and felt a stubborn, defiant hope that maybe, somehow, the principles it was supposed to represent might someday actually mean something again. Most mornings, he just looked at it and remembered the person he'd been before asking a single question had cost him everything, a person who'd loved his country simply, completely, without complication. He couldn't be that person anymore. That innocence was gone, burned away in the harsh light of a truth he'd never wanted to learn, that the distance between patriot and enemy could be crossed with a single honest word. But he could remember him. That man who'd believed flags and windows meant something. Who'd trusted that doing the right thing would be recognized as such. Who'd thought his country would protect him because he'd always been loyal to it. Thomas Brennan had been a patriot. Until he asked questions. And perhaps, in a way that would have broken his younger self's heart to understand, that was when his real patriotism began, in the cold ashes of everything he'd lost, in the recognition that loving your country sometimes meant fighting for what it should be, not defending what it had become. The flag hung in the window. The world turned. And Thomas remained, diminished but unbroken, waiting for a dawn that might never come, but refusing to stop believing it could. The end. They were patriots, until they asked questions. A story about the cost of truth in an age of enforced certainty.